Imagine you wake up tomorrow and realize you may not need to keep pouring money into retirement every single month. Not because you got lucky, not because you sold a company, not because you hit the lottery, because the money you already invested may already be enough to grow on its own and carry you to retirement. That idea is called Coast Fire. And if you stay with me until the end, I'm going to give you a simple test you can use on your own numbers to figure out whether this is actually realistic for you or whether you've just been sold a nice sounding fantasy online. So let's break this down in plain English. Coast Fire means you build up enough money early enough that even if you stop contributing to retirement, that money could still grow on its own and reach your retirement target later. You are not retired today, you still need income, you still need to work, you still need to pay your bills, but you may not need to save as aggressively anymore because compounding can start doing more of the heavy lifting for you. That is why the idea is so powerful. It gives people a checkpoint. Not I'm done forever, more like I may be a lot closer to freedom than I thought. Let's make this real. Let's say Daniel is 40 years old. He's been doing the right things. He's saving, investing, trying to be responsible. Then one day he starts asking a better question. Not what stock is going to explode next year. Not how do I get rich overnight. He asks, at what point does my money start working harder than I do? That is the right question, because once you start asking that question, you stop thinking like someone chasing paychecks and start thinking like someone building freedom. So how do we calculate Coast Fire? There are really three big variables. First, how much income you want in retirement. Second, how many years you have until retirement. Third, what rate of return your investments can earn after inflation. The last part is where people get confused. So let me make it simple. If your investments grow 7% a year, but inflation is 3%, your real return is roughly 4%. Real return just means your growth after inflation has chipped away at your purchasing power. So when people use a 4% real return assumption, they're usually saying something like this. Maybe my portfolio earns 6 to 7% over time. Inflation takes 2 to 3%. And what's left in real purchasing power is around 3 to 5%. That is one use of 4%. But there is another 4% idea you also hear in retirement planning, and this is different. The 4% rule is about withdrawals, not your investment returns. It comes from retirement research that basically asked if someone retires and starts withdrawing about 4% of their portfolio each year, what are the odds the money lasts? So do not mix these two up. One is a rough real return assumption, the other is a rough withdrawal rule. Not the same thing. So let's go back to Daniel. Let's say Daniel wants $80,000 a year in retirement. A shortcut a lot of people use is to multiply that by 25. Why 25? Because if you withdraw 4% from a portfolio, that means you roughly need 25 times your annual spending. So $80,000 times 25 gives you a retirement target of $2 million. Now the Coast Fire question becomes this. How much money does Daniel need today so that if he stopped contributing, that money could still grow into $2 million by retirement? Let's say Daniel wants to retire in 15 years. If he uses a conservative 4% real return, he would need roughly 1.1 million invested today. That is the Coast Fire concept. If he already has about 1.1 million invested and it compounds at 4% above inflation for 15 years, he may be already in the Coast Fire zone. Now let me give you the more optimistic version too, because this is where a lot of people push back. A lot of people will say, hold on, the S&P 500 has averaged closer to 10% a year over the long run. So why are we using a 4% real return? Fair question. And yes, if you start with a higher long-term market return and subtract inflation, you can absolutely get to a higher real return number, maybe 6%, maybe 7% in a more optimistic case. But here's the problem. Retirement planning should not be built on your most optimistic assumption. It should be built on an assumption that leaves room for bad years, inflation, fees, taxes, and reality. So the wise thing to do is to not pick one number and marry it. Run a conservative case, run a moderate case, run an optimistic case. That way, you are not building your future on hope. Now, here is another milestone that I think is one of the most motivating in all of personal finance. It is the point where your portfolio's expected annual growth becomes bigger than the amount you personally contribute each year. Let's say Daniel is contributing $25,000 a year and using a 4% real return assumption. Once his portfolio gets to around $625,000, 4% of that is $25,000. This means in theory, the portfolio is now pulling as much weight as he is. That is a huge psychological shift because now the machine is not just being fed by Daniel, the machine is starting to feed itself. That is when people stop feeling like they are pushing a boulder uphill and start feeling like compounding is finally on their side. Now let me show you where people mess this up. Mistake number one, they assume average returns show up in a straight line. They do not. 1 year the market is up. 1 year the market is down. 1 year inflation is ugly. 1 year life punches you in the face. So average returns are useful for rough planning, but dangerous if you treat them like promises. Mistake number two, they ignore taxes and account structure. That is where a lot of online finance content gets way too shallow. In Canada, for example, an RRSP is tax deferred. That means you usually get a tax deduction when you put money in, but later on, when you take that money out, it is taxable. Later in life, an RSP often becomes a RIF. A RIF is basically the next stage of the account where the government makes you start pulling money out. And then when you have things like OAS clawback just means if your income gets high enough in retirement, the government starts taking back some of your old age security. So if somebody says, I need $2 million to retire, my first question is, okay, but where is the $2 million sitting? Because what you keep after tax is what actually pays your bills. Mistake number three, they treat Coast Fire like it is a full retirement plan. It is not. It is a milestone, a useful milestone, yes. A powerful milestone, yes, but still just a milestone. A real retirement plan also has to think about taxes, inflation shocks, healthcare, market timing, family changes, and whether your spending can bend when life does not go exactly to plan. So here is a simple test I promised you. Question 1. How much do you want to spend each year in retirement in today's dollars? Question 2. How many years do you have until you want work to become optional? Question 3. What is your honest real return assumption after inflation and after some humility? If you can answer those 3 questions, you could start estimating your Coast Fire number properly. And if you cannot answer them yet, that is okay, but it means you do not have a real plan yet. You have hope, and hope is not a strategy. So here's the bottom line. Coast Fire is real. The math is useful. The concept is powerful, but the internet version is often too shallow. The real game is not just compounding, it is compounding plus inflation, plus taxes, plus timing, plus behavior. That is what separates a fun idea from a serious plan. If you want help thinking through your own situation, your timeline, your retirement number, your account mix, and what assumptions actually make sense for you, click the link in my bio to book a one-on-one strategy call. I love helping people think this stuff through before they waste years heading in the wrong direction. This is for educational purposes and reflects my personal opinion only. This is not financial, legal, or tax advice.